Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the Hispanic Digital Marketing webinar, where we will be going over the research results of our Path to Purchase study. We're just going to give 5 more minutes to let some more attendees log on here. Just some housekeeping. We are going to field questions at the end. So there's a chat box there to your right. So feel free to write questions as they come up in the presentation, and I'll be making notes, and we will go ahead and answer them at the end. So those have just kind of logging in, we're just going to wait 5 more minutes. We will start sharp at 10:05, and thanks again for joining. And for those of you that are logging in right now, we're just going to give a couple minutes here to let people log in case people have been having issues. Hey everyone, thanks for joining the Hispanic Digital Marketing webinar. We're going to go over research results on online path to purchase study we conducted. Just letting people log in here. For those of you just joining us, we're going to be answering questions. So as we go through the presentation, please feel free to type in any questions that you have there in the chat box. I'll be making note of them, and we'll go ahead and answer those at the end. Hi, Lisette. Hi, Lisa. Hey, everyone. For those logging in, just giving a couple minutes for people to log in. We're going to start 10:05. Hey, everyone, just waiting a couple minutes. I think there's some questions. You don't have to mute yourselves. If you have any questions as the presentation is going through, feel free to just write it in the chat box, and we're going to be addressing it there at the end. It's 10:03. Just going to wait 2 more minutes to let some people log in. We still have people logging in here. Thanks for joining. Hi, everyone. For people just logging in, thanks for joining the Hispanic Digital Marketing webinar. We're going to be going over the research results on our most recent study on Hispanic online path to purchase. 1 more minute, we're going to be starting. If you have any questions, please feel free to write it there in the chat box. We're going to address them at the end. Someone just asked if we're going to be sharing the presentation PowerPoint after the call, and we'll be sending out an email where you can download the presentation for those that have attended. All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the Hispanic Digital Marketing webinar. Excited to be presenting the research results for our most recent study on online path to purchase. Housekeeping, you see people already using the chat, which is great. If you have questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box as we're going along. I'll be making note of the questions and we'll go ahead and address them there at the end. So we're going to get started here. Maria, do you want to kind of quickly go over the table of contents?
Hi, Mario. Well, let's do a team introduction first. My name is Maria Twena. I have been in marketing for over 30 years, 20 of which were in the general market space. And about 12 years ago, while I was at McCann, I pivoted to the bilingual bicultural space. I have been a bilingual bicultural my whole life, so I'm passionate about this study and the Latino market in general. And I currently head up Consumer X, which is a discipline within Ninth Wonder focused on consumers that hide in plain sight, yet drive exponential revenue and fandom for a brand. And Mario, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself first.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Mario Carrasco. I'm co-founder and principal of ThinkNow. I've been in the market research space for 15 years and dedicated to both Hispanic and multicultural insights for the past 15 years. I built what became to be one of the first nationally representative Hispanic online panels at a company called Garcia Research that was then purchased by GfK. Co-founded ThinkNow in 2011, and excited to be partnering with Ninth Wonder and Maria on this great research.
Thanks, Mario. Okay, so just to review what we're going to be reviewing today, we're going to have a little brief overview of COVID and Hispanics because it makes all of this that much more relevant as more and more Hispanics are spending time online with the pandemic. We're going to have a discussion on Latinx and just to ground everyone on generations and acculturation. We'll review the research, what our goal was, and the methodology to get to our results. Then we'll review the results. This online path to purchase, we focused on three key consumer touch points, if you will, from search, how Hispanics search to and who they search for, to content consumption, how is the content consumed and how does that differ across acculturation levels, to the actual shopping or e-commerce transaction. So one of the things that's so exciting about this research is that it's not just a topical view of the Hispanic market. We have a deeper dive into acculturation levels, and there are significant differences worth noting. And then we'll share our conclusions, some guideposts for brands interested in targeting Hispanics online, and then we'll take some questions. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the agency. We're basically a collection of specialist agencies with 5 offices in the U.S., corporate headquarters in Houston, and 2 offices outside of the U.S., one in Buenos Aires and one in Vietnam. Those 2 focus primarily on digital creative production and design. We are what you would expect from any full service agency. We have all of the disciplines in-house. So we're a full service shop, from business analytics to strategy to creative to CRM and PR and digital customer experience to our Consumer X discipline as well, and media planning and buying. So we really cover the whole gamut of typical agency services. Mario, let's hear about ThinkNow.
Yep, a little bit about ThinkNow. So we are a full-service market research firm offering full-service research, analytics. We just launched our newest product called Connect, which is an on-demand multicultural MarTech tool. And we're really focusing on bringing the most cutting-edge technologies to bear on multicultural market research. We also own and operate one of the largest U.S. Hispanic panels in the U.S., and that's the panel that we tapped into for this research. And some of our core work, awareness, attitude, and usage studies, been doing a lot of online focus groups here now during COVID, and also we do some behavioral research, which is really interesting with our product called Noe, where we enable people to download an application onto their phone. We track their behavior and follow that up with surveys. And then the omnibus is actually what the product that we use to conduct this research, which goes out to a nationally representative sample every month to 500 US Hispanics, 250 non-Hispanic whites, 250 Asians, and 250 African Americans, so you get a total market read. So we wanted to, before we dive into the results of the research that we conducted, we wanted to give some context, and our friends at H Code did some great research on what Hispanics are doing online during the outbreak. And so first wanted to look over the top 3 news sources used most by Hispanics during the outbreak. Number 1 by far was TV news at 48%, and then you see a big jump down to social media at 26%, and then online newspaper at 19%. What we found really interesting about this is that Latinos in the US are younger as a whole than the general market. And so you would assume that social media would be number 1 in terms of news consumption. But TV news jumping to the top really points to the collectivist nature that Maria is going to talk about more, the collectivist natures of Latinos here in the US, where TV is a medium that everybody in the household can use and consume. So we thought that was an interesting stat there. Then looking at websites visited during the outbreak among Latinos, we see YouTube is number 1, 61%. Of course, number 2, Amazon for online shopping. We're going to get a little bit more into that. Newspapers at number 3, and then grocery store sites at 24%. Delving more specifically into online shopping, well, I wanted to show you the similarities and differences between Hispanics and the general population when it comes to online shopping. When looking at how often, multiple times a day, we see Hispanics and the general population pretty much on par, 14% for Hispanics, 13% for the general population. What we see the bigger difference is when we look at every day. So 16% of Hispanics are shopping online every day versus 13% of the general population. And keep this stat in mind when we're looking over the path to purchase research that we're going to be going over, because this is really impactful when we're looking at the specific path to purchase for online for Hispanics.
Great, thanks, Mario. So I'm going to do just a brief dive into the Hispanic population across generations and acculturation levels to ground everyone and make sure you understand where we're coming from. The Latinx you see here is not a typo. We refer to Latinx within the Consumer X discipline at Ninth Wonder as the influential Hispanics in the Hispanic market, and you'll understand that a little bit later as we go through this. So let's just a brief snapshot for those that are unfamiliar with the market. $2 trillion in purchasing power, 60 million strong, 20% of the US population. But as with all groups, they are distinct from the rest of the population in many ways. So the first thing we know is that 27% live in multi-generational households. Compared to the US, which is at 13%, we see there's a difference here already. In terms of number of household members, they're typically larger households at 3.26 members. Almost half of them have children under the age of 18 living in their homes, a great contrast from the general population at 28%. The median age of Hispanics is 27.6. And I should note that the median age of Hispanics is younger than not just the non-Hispanic white population, but younger than the non-Hispanic Black and the non-Hispanic Asian population as well. And in terms of cumulative lifetime household spend, a Hispanic family will outspend a non-Hispanic family by about $500,000. And the reason is they have larger families. They tend to live longer. Their lifespan is at 82 years versus 79 for non-Hispanic white Americans. And they have a larger household, full stop. So when you look at the households, they are different. And then if you look at the generations in the household, it's important to understand how they too are distinct from each other and from the general market. So let's go through a couple of the generational differences to make sure everyone is clear about this. First, start with the first generation here on the left. So typically a first generation, according to the census, is a foreign-born immigrant that came to the US at the age of 10 or older. They represent 28% of the population today. In previous decades, they represented a lot more and they were the largest cohort, but today they represent 28%. And we refer to them at Ninth Wonder as Spanish language first Hispanics, meaning they prefer to consume content in Spanish. Second, we have the 1.5 generation, which is right under that. The 1.5 generation is also foreign born. They came to the US at the age of 10 or less. So their primary socialization takes place here. We refer to them as the English language first because their preference is to consume content in English. The 1.5 was lost for many years in the data sets, and it actually represented 26% of the first generation. So it's important to distinguish between generational status to better understand how to serve the market with messaging and advertising. The second generation is US born with at least one parent that's foreign born. This group is also English language first in terms of content consumption. So when I refer to Latinx with a big X, we're talking about the 1.5 and the 2.0 generation, which together comprise 55% of the Hispanic market today, the largest group. Third generation, US born, at least one parent is a second generation immigrant, but both parents are US born. They represent 17% of the population. Why we refer to Latinx, this 1.5 and 2.0 English language first consumer cohort with a big X, is because these tend to be the influencers across the Hispanic market. And the question is always why? As children of immigrants, these are the individuals that translate the language for their parents, interpret the US ethos for their parents, which we're going to talk about in a second, inform brand and product purchases at a very early age, demystify services and new technologies. So as at an early age, these folks are playing the role of Sherpa for their foreign-born parents. And as they mature, that Sherpa role expands. It doesn't contract. So it's not like you turn 21 and you stop being an influencer. What actually happens is that they have a sphere of influence that as they mature becomes more and more culturally agnostic. It's not just Spanish dominant, and they continue their influencing behavior. So this is a group that all marketers really need to watch. So let's talk about the ethos and how they are distinct across the Hispanic market. If you look at the far right, the first thing you'll notice there is a box that says American Ethos. The American Ethos for all of you who are not Hispanic out there and for the Hispanics out there is informed by three basic pillars. We're morally upright. We employ the Protestant work ethic, which is very much informed by being disciplined and frugal, and we value self-reliance. So above all, we are very individualistic. If you have a chance to read Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, while it's not, I don't agree with a lot of his thinking, I do agree with his thinking on the American ethos. Now, if you look at the Latinx ethos all the way to the left, we too are morally upright. We don't employ a Protestant work ethic, we employ a balanced work ethic. And what that means is that we have to have time for family and friends, even though we work hard, because we value above all interdependence and interconnectedness. And this is called the ethos of collectivism, which is shared with some other countries as well. It's not just a Latino phenomenon. So you've got collectivism and individualism. Very different ethos. None is better than the other. They're just very different. So when you look at an individualist consumer, they're more likely, for example, to dress for comfort. If you look at a collectivist consumer, they're more likely to dress for appearances because what others think about them matters because they're part of a collective. It's always about community over self. Also, if you think about their experience when they go into a fast food restaurant, for example, they want to feel, the collectivist wants to feel welcome and they want the experience to be positive, and they bring their family. The individualist wants more of the convenience. They're very different in terms of how they perceive the world and engage with the world. And if you ask a collectivist, what drives you, they will always say family. You ask an individualist or someone who's very self-reliant, they'll say self. And then smack in the middle, you've got these bilingual biculturals, which are the English language first 1.5 and 2.0 generations, which are hybrids. They live a duality few really understand. They're collectivist sometimes and they're individualistic sometimes, yet they're highly influential. If you ask them in focus groups, what drives you? Is it family, self, or something else? They will say family first and immediately say self. They'll say both of them drive me. So they very much have their collectivist framework and upbringing, but they also have the self-reliance that they're taught in American schools here in the US. So this group is important because, again, they're Sherpas not just for their foreign-born relatives, but also for their children and their sphere of influence. Now, online Hispanics, we see some of that collectivist behavior online, and as we go through the results of the findings, we're going to see it even more. Since we're moving online, let's just take a brief snapshot of the online Hispanic. 5 times more likely to share content they consume in comparison to non-Hispanic whites. Why are they sharing? Again, very much rooted in this collectivist mindset, even though they tend to be bicultural as well. Twice as likely to purchase the products they share when you compare them to non-Hispanics. They're 35% more likely to have their content clicked on when they share it versus a non-Hispanic. Again, they have a sphere of influence that's tight. And then Facebook actually reports that Hispanic consumers overall are much more diverse than those of non-Hispanic whites, which makes sense because, as we talked earlier, they become influential and their sphere of influence over time becomes culturally agnostic. Now, let's look at the research findings. Mario's going to walk you through the objective and the methodology, and I'll share the results with you. Mario?
Great. Thank you, Maria. So we'll quickly go over the objective here. Really wanted to look at the hypothesis that the Hispanic online consumer journey from search all the way to path to purchase is distinct from the general market online consumer journey. So we wanted to look at what are those differences and what are those similarities. So we fielded this partnering with Ninth Wonder through our panel. We fielded it on March 2020. We looked at a representative sample of 500 US Hispanics, and we'll go over how we broke that down. This was national, ages 18 to 64, and it was both English and Spanish. I saw a question there, and for those that just kind of joining, please feel free to use the chat box to ask questions. We're going to go ahead, make note of that and answer that at the end. In terms of how the study fell out, we had 60% of our sample US born, 40% foreign born. We allowed respondents to choose what language they wanted to take the survey in. 78% took the survey in English, 22% took the survey in Spanish. And you'll see that discrepancy between foreign-born, US-born, English, and Spanish, and that discrepancy there really is that 1.5 generation that Maria was talking about earlier. And we're going to dig into more deeply here in the research results. And for those of you that want to see how the respondents broke out, we're going to make this available, of course, after the webinar. But here you'll see the age breaks in terms of how the respondents broke out. We also weighted it by the 5 main census regions in terms of how Hispanics fall out across the US and the 9 sub-regions. And so 75% of respondents were either millennials or Gen X, 77% mirroring the Hispanic population residing in the West and the South. And then we had a nice breakout in terms of education levels. And there was a question in terms of the language breaks, and we're going to be getting into that more in the research results. But we did also weight it by language And you can see here how that fell out, with 51% of respondents primarily engaging in English online, 36% bilingual, engaging both Spanish and English, and some other stats here regarding radio as well as print. Broadcast is where we saw Hispanics most engaging with both Spanish and English equally.
Great, thanks, Mario. So let's go through the research results. And again, we took that extra step of not just getting the research by Hispanics, we actually broke it then down by acculturation levels, because you start seeing slight differences in behavior. So let's start with search. 8 out of 10 of the Hispanics on this study said they had been asked by relatives who weren't fluent in English to go online and to research something to buy. 8 out of 10, 81%, huge number. When you break it down, we asked them, where are these relatives coming from? 57% said they're relatives inside the household. 51% said they're relatives in the US, but not in the household. And 24% said it's relatives in another country outside the US. We thought this was really fascinating. And when we look at the data a little deeper, the Spanish language first, which makes sense, we're more likely to be receiving requests from relatives in their homes and in another country. Makes perfect sense, right? They're the ones that are mostly connected to the mother country. And the English language first were more likely to receive requests equally from both relatives in their households or relatives in the US, but not in their households. So these are relatives, they have moved away from the family home clearly, and these are relatives in the US that are asking them for help. So both groups play the role of digital Sherpas, but they play it for different groups. The Spanish language first for those in their household and outside of the US, and the English language first for those inside their households and outside of their households, but in the US. Very interesting finding. Also, we asked, what is the trigger for assistance, or why are they asking for help? 59% said they're asking for help because they're not digitally savvy, which makes sense. And 61% said they're not asking for help because they have issues with the English language, okay? But when you break that down across acculturation levels, again, language issues are the primary driver of why the Spanish language first is being asked for online assistance, which again makes sense, and both digital savviness or internet discomfort and language are the drivers for the relatives engaging the English language first. That can be a product of many things, including age and the fact that a lot are digital natives, etc. But the English language first are receiving requests because those in their sphere of influence aren't comfortable with either the language nor with the internet. Now, when we asked them about search, most of them, over half of them, 52%, conduct research in English only. 25% reported that they conduct research in both languages, English and Spanish, and 23% said they conduct it in Spanish only. As you would expect, 80% of the English language first reported that they conduct the research in English or in both languages. 72% of the Spanish language first conduct in English or in both languages. So it's not that far apart. What's important for marketers to understand is, what is your search strategy if you are targeting the Hispanic market? Because they're not all searching in English exclusively, and making sure you have the correct terms and in multilingual strategies is going to save the day. Now, sharing content. We know sharing content is a big part of the Hispanic market. We talked about that earlier, and we saw that earlier as part of that collective ethos. We start seeing some slight differences here in when it comes to acculturation level, which we thought was very interesting. So 78% said they share content by verbally translating for the relative. Just think about that for a second, because that's an incredible investment of time. 78% say they verbally translate for a relative. And as you would expect, there was a skew to the Spanish language first translating verbally more so than the English language first. Now, 27% said they use Google Translate or another translation app. This skewed more toward the English language first and the Spanish language first. And you could argue the why. The why could be, again, digital savviness. It could also be maybe that English language first isn't completely bilingual or biliterate and isn't that comfortable doing the verbal translation. Regardless, there's a difference already right there in terms of the sharing. 16% said they send the information to someone else to translate for relatives. Again, a very interesting finding. That's an extra step that they're taking. And there was a skew here toward the Spanish language first. Again, that nod to collectivism, community over self, helping your family, and that being more important than yourself. 15% say they actually find the Spanish web page for the relative to review the information. Again, a skew toward the Spanish language first. And 6% said they share the information in English but don't translate it. Not surprisingly, that's an English language first skew. Again, this group is more bicultural, so they live in both worlds. So they want to help the relatives, but there's a certain point where they say you take care of it. That's where their self-reliance kicks in. So we thought these were very interesting findings. We know sharing content is a critical step of the collective customer journey. So brands need to support in-language content, and they need to facilitate sharing as well as translation, because there is a burden that's being placed again on that translator, that 1.5 2.0, and the Spanish Dom in some cases when they're helping out their Span Dom relatives. So important to make sure that we facilitate this process across the board. Now, when it comes to purchasing product, who typically makes the purchase once the research is completed? Half said that they themselves make the purchase on an English site. That there was a skew towards Spanish language first here. Again, that collectivist nod. But both of them said they make the purchase on an English site. 18% said that they make the purchase on a Spanish site. Again, the skew to Spanish language first, not only because of that collectivist bent, but because it's in Spanish. 25% reported that they'll help the relative in making the purchase on an English or Spanish site. Not surprising, helping the relative and not doing it for them. English language first, the skew moves toward that group. And 8% reported that the relative typically makes the purchase on their own. English language first was twice as likely as the Spanish language first to report that the relative makes the purchase on their own. Very interesting finding. Again, that skew toward biculturalism, important to help them, but you can do it by yourself, right? So interesting findings across the board here. For brands that are paying attention, 68% are making purchases online for others. 25% are assisting relatives. There's got to be a better way to do this, folks. You've got to be able to help these individuals go through their e-commerce transactions in a simpler way, empowering them and remove the burden and the onus off of that 1.5 2.0 generation English language first, and the Spanish language first, for that matter, especially those that are helping relatives outside of the U.S. or in their homes. So what did we find besides these differences in acculturation? Let's just revisit that before we talk about some guideposts for brands. The Hispanic market reflects a collective ethos. We know that, both offline and online, yet activities vary based on acculturation level. The bicultural behave a little differently online than the collectivists do. Hispanics are assisting members of the collective, not only at home, but outside of their homes and outside of the U.S. altogether. So remember that when you say, I'm going to do a Hispanic market campaign, who are you targeting? And if it's online, what is the expectation? Who do you think you're reaching? How can you help them navigate through this online purchase path longitudinally? From search to content consumption to e-commerce transaction, the path to purchase is distinct from the non-Hispanic path to purchase, full stop. And the reason is language proficiency levels and digital savvy. Understand that this group needs a little more assistance when it comes to purchasing online. The lack of Spanish language content or translation tools across these touch points that we've been talking about puts an onus on the role, the individuals that are playing the role of digital Sherpa for their relatives. And you don't want to do that because ultimately it does create a negative brand experience for that consumer. And if that consumer is a Sherpa and is an influencer, why would you want to create a negative brand experience? You want them to be your champion and an advocate for you. The bidirectional toggle informs e-commerce transactions. So the bidirectional toggle, we see it offline all the time with biculturals going back and forth across language and across culture. And we need to be very aware of it when it comes to e-commerce transactions. So years ago, I had a brand come to me saying, you know, we spent all this money on Spanish language advertising, targeting this Spanish language dominant consumer, and we didn't see the lift in our e-commerce transactions. And we requested the data to analyze it to figure out what was going on. And the toggle is really about, in many first generation homes, there is one key computer that is used by the family. They may have multiple individual ones, but one used by the family. And what happens many times is the parents will ask their sons or daughters to search for them. And so the first thing that we see is that search happens in English, and we see that here in some cases as well. What happens is when the child then finds a Spanish language page or translates the page via an app for the parents, they then turn the computer over to the parents so that content consumption happens in their native tongue, so it happens in Spanish. So you have two events happening: search in English, content consumption in Spanish. When the parents decide, yes, I want to get that, they direct their son or daughter to execute the purchase, and the computer goes back to that individual and they execute the purchase. And because they're English language first, they execute it in English. So you've had search happen in English, content consumption in Spanish, e-commerce transaction in English. Guess who gets credit for that transaction? General market does, not the Hispanic market. So it's imperative that we are not only aware of this, but that we're putting tags on our pages, especially for those out there who have Spanish language pages as well as English language pages, so you can follow that consumer journey and attribute e-commerce transactions correctly so you can have a better ROI and better inform future campaigns. Now, some guideposts for brands. Consider Hispanics when developing your online strategy. That's a given. Only 52% reported that they're conducting their search exclusively in English. So you're leaving a lot of opportunity on the table if you don't have a bilingual search strategy to address the total Hispanic market's needs. Develop a Spanish language site to assist that 78% that are verbally translating for their relatives. Trust me, I do it all the time. I know most of you on this call do it as well. It is a burden, and we do it out of love, but it is a burden. So brands do stand out, the ones that actually facilitate that process. In the absence of a site, have translation apps that work well and that they're readily available at the consumer's fingertips to simplify that burden. And remember, while this may be an option, it's not the best approach because apps do not carry the brand voice with them. The brand voice is typically lost in the translation, if you will. So it's not a best practice, but it's better than not having anything available for these consumers. Invest in a toll-free number in Spanish or live Spanish chat so that consumers can engage for assistance. These assets with a Spanish language website will provide the support that the consumers need. And especially if you think about, you know, there's a lot of impulsive buying out there. So if you need to talk to someone or engage with someone and you don't have the opportunity to do that, that's a lost sales many times. And these are collective consumers by nature. They enjoy talking to people. Their word of mouth is important. Connecting and engaging is important. So facilitate that for them and bring your brand to life in their language and in their culture, because it's imperative that you are culturally and linguistically relevant in everything you do for this consumer cohort. And finally, create a friend, or sorry, tell a family. We always say tell a friend, and I think with the Hispanic market, we should say tell a family, tell the family member app, or something to that approach that facilitates sharing so users can easily send information to a relative or a friend that's Spanish language dominant or of another culture, another language, and users can then pick the language and the medium in which to share. It would be so easy if I was on a site and I've got a Spanish dominant relative that's not online and not completely biliterate, that I could say, oh, I know so-and-so would want this, that I could easily click a button and say, please send this information to X. Tell her it's from me. So it allows me to co-brand it, but allows me to send it to her via direct mail because she's not online, and send it to her in Spanish because that's her preferred language. So it does many things. It validates me as an influencer. It helps the recipient because they're getting co-branded information. It has your Good Housekeeping seal of approval, and you're facilitating their process. And it helps the brand because the brand can say, oh, we need to treat Maria a little differently as part of our CRM program because she's an influencer, and I've done all the work for the brand. Then the brand knows that this consumer X that just received all of this information is interested in this particular product or service. I can follow up with them in language. So think about all of that when you're thinking about the Hispanic market, because it sounds complicated. It's not. It just requires a little more time and investment, and the ROI will definitely be realized. We just wanted to put up some testimonials here from Latinx that have all played this role of Sherpa for family members and online Sherpa, if not offline Sherpa, and just to speak to the significance and the import of validating them and giving them the tools to facilitate their life and their influence. So I'll let you guys read that for a moment before we keep going here.
Great. Thank you, Maria. And thanks, everyone. Maria, are you ready to field some questions?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go back up here. Let's see if I can figure out this video thing here as well. All right. Okay, so let me get up here. We got a lot of questions, so keep them coming if you have questions here. So got a couple of questions on if this is going to be available. Yes, we're going to be emailing this out. A question here, Maria, do you work in both English and Spanish when reaching Hispanics? In terms of the study, definitely. And I think, I mean, do you want to touch base a little bit more on in terms of English and Spanish in terms of the marketing implications, Maria?
Yeah, sure. So I've spent, as I said earlier, many years focused on this target and have done a lot of campaigns and research with brands on best practices, developing best practices. And what we have found is when you target that Spanish dominant, Spanish language first consumer, you speak to them in Spanish and culturally with a collectivist bent. So it's not just in language, it's got to be in culture. As a best practice, when we speak to the bilingual, bicultural, we speak to them primarily in English because they're English language first content consumers, but we wink at them in Spanish. And the wink can be a whole separate presentation, Mario, someday, but the wink is really a cultural or linguistic cue or nuance that lets that consumer know we are speaking to you. And they feel so validated when that happens, as all consumers do. We all want to see ourselves in marketing, and they respond to it. So it's important to understand which cohort you're speaking to, and to make sure that you're activating not just language, but cultural insights as well.
Yeah, and a couple more questions on that same vein. This is, I think, referring to some of the slides earlier in the deck, but the question from Elena is lack of Spanish language content a factor? And I think you kind of answered that towards the end there.
Yeah, absolutely. Lack of Spanish language is content is a huge factor, I think. Absolutely.
Okay. I have a question regarding the sample. Does the Latinx data include Puerto Ricans? It does. It does not include the territory of Puerto Rico, however, but it does include Puerto Ricans as part of the sample. Did participants identify themselves as Hispanic or Latino? Yes, they did. Then another question, what's the right way in terms of comfort? We didn't go into that in this study in terms of preference of how Latinos, Latinx, Hispanics prefer to identify as. We do have that research though. We have quite a bit on our website, thinknow.com, in terms of how Latinos identify.
Yeah.
This is a good question from Lainey. Was their search engine set to Spanish or English? We see that most are set to English, but they search words in Spanish. And Maria, you and I have had conversations about this. Again, another whole webinar we can do.
We could do another one on the browser. There is this, it's a misperception out there that the Hispanics will automatically set their browsers to Spanish if that's their preferred language. It's just not the case. We haven't seen that across the board. So it's important to have a multilingual strategy across browser settings as well.
Leslie, can you define what it means to purchase online? Does this also include calling and making an appointment? I think that's a good question. I don't think we necessarily dove into that, but you mentioned that a little bit in terms of a call to action of having a phone number, for example. A question from Felipe. Do you think it's more cost efficient for brands to make their pages available in Spanish and nudge Spanish first consumers to do more of their own searches? Or is it better to just optimize search strategy for the current dynamics?
You know, I'm biased to ideally having Spanish language content available for Spanish dominant consumers. I just think it's important. It says something about the brand. It says, I welcome you, you matter. I've taken the time to engage with you in a culturally and linguistically authentic way. And I think there's no substitute for that. I don't think what we have now is a best practice.
Great. Research question here. Do we have Spanish language first and English language first cut by age? We do. So you can reach out to us and we can get that data out. Love some of the comments here. A lot of people relating to the 1.5.
Oh, go 1.5. Yeah, you've been hidden for too long.
Definitely. Yeah, that was actually a comment here. How can we contact you? We have landing pages, so everybody that registered, we should be sending out a link. So feel free to contact us there through the contact us form that we'll be sending out. Any of your studies tied to any of the U.S. Census? Yes, we use the U.S. Census as the marker to create how we create the representative sample. So we had that slide of the 5 census regions and the 9 subregions. We use that along with age, education, income, country of origin to create a representative sample. Here's a question from John. Were the search questions in the survey specific to search activity for products and services or just search activity in general, including news and sports?
Great question. It was search in general. The plan and the goal is to dive a little deeper into product and service segments so we can have a better understanding of how price of the product or service informs the behavior, etc. Great question.
Jenny, do you have any evidence to support Spanglish language advertising to target generations 1.5? Would this be the link that you suggested?
Yes, I've got a ton of evidence, Jenny. And, you know, I try to not use the term Spanglish only because I feel like it's been it feels a little different than what we do. What we do is much more informed by psychographics and respect for both languages, and it's not a mashup, if you will. It's more of an understanding that this is an English language first consumer, but speaking to them with some nod to their cultural sensitivity and heritage is more important than just speaking to them as if they were either completely Spanish Dom, which they're not, or completely American, which they're not. Because, you know, there's this, and I've run into this in the past, many brands will say, well, if they're English language first, I'm reaching them with my English language advertising. It's like, you're reaching them, but you're not touching them. I mean, I'm not brand loyal to your brand because I see your ad in English. I don't see myself in the ad, and you're not speaking to me in a way that I can relate to. It's different. Oh, thank you. Yes, that's what you meant by Spanglish. Yes, many people use it as Spanglish. It's basically the wink.
So more of a philosophical question here, I guess. Latinos are becoming more and more general market. Is it beneficial for a CMO to keep segmenting Latinos into multicultural markets?
Yeah, so I think so. You know, the term multicultural, I'm not a huge fan of it because it kind of makes everything a little vanilla in a way. We're all multicultural, so we're all the same because we're all different. That's not the same. That's not true. We're all different because we're all different. So it's almost like unicultural, if you will. Yeah, I'm bicultural, but there should be a bicultural strategy for biculturals, a Spanish dominant strategy for the Span-Dom, the Asians. Everything should be, I think, if you're truly going to do this from a place of, it's not just about driving ROI, it's not just quantitative, there's qualitative in here too, right? If you want to actually embrace and validate and drive advocacy and fandom, you need to care. So I personally prefer to segment all groups in their own cultural element and keeping that as crystal clear as possible instead of lumping everyone into a multicultural approach.
I agree. Still got some couple more questions coming in through here. Carmen asking, do you think that a nod to the segment in an English language piece makes more sense than dual language?
Well, it depends, Carmen, on the target and how big is the nod, to be honest. Some people think the nod is really more than anything when it's advertising and what have you. If you know you're targeting someone that's in a multi-generational household, if you will, that has English speakers and Spanish speakers, then it's fine to do a piece that one is in English and one is in Spanish. So it's a dual language approach. But I think it really depends on what the objective is, who you're targeting, and what medium you're using. If this is an online ad, if it's an above the line ad, what the situation is.
Question from Vanessa. How do you engage with corporate leaders with the lack of Latinx leadership to help them understand the importance of spending the effort?
Okay, I'm going to tell you guys my famous story, which happened about 10 years ago, which really marked me. It made me realize the story of biculturals is not just a Hispanic story, which clearly we all know that, right? I mean, if you're coming from a collectivist culture or collectivist country with a different language, you are going to be bicultural in the sense that your culture is not the same as your parents' culture, and the language is different. So I was at a major car manufacturer in Detroit many years ago presenting the story of the bilingual, bicultural market. And when I finished, mind you, there was no Hispanic in the room. And I thought, well, this is going to be a tough crowd. And when I finished, I asked if there were any questions, and this guy in the back of the room raises his hand. He goes, I'm going to stand up for a second. And he said, Maria, my name is Robert. I want you to know that what you shared today has opened my eyes to my whole life, which I have never stopped to even think about. He said, I am a second generation Polish immigrant. My parents only spoke Polish. And I'm going to share something with you that I have not shared with many people, but I think only you will understand. I bought my first car when I was 10 years old. and it brought tears to my eyes because I thought, of course you did, because you did everything for your parents. You translated the contract, you told them where to sign, you negotiated with the sales guy. And it's not just our story. So I think the more we can identify senior management folks that may have an immigrant story that's closer to their life experience, when it's not just an ROI story, it's like, let's make it personal. I think the better you're served.
Yeah, that's great. And I feel like this is a tangentially related question in that should we focus more on visuals, Latino actors, audio, music to connect with the Latino market? I think I know how you're going to answer that, Maria, but would like your take there.
It depends on who your target is, right? Yeah. It just depends. If you're targeting a Spanish dominant consumer, you may want to include more Hispanic cues. Obviously, the language should be in Spanish. And if you know their countries of origin, I hope I'm not confusing questions, but I'm seeing something there about Mexican Spanish. You should obviously, if you're going to wink, make sure it's as authentic as you can. Okay, so if you know you're targeting LA Hispanics and the majority of Hispanics are of Mexican descent, then your wink should be greatly informed by the Mexican culture, right? So I think it's important that you understand who you're targeting, and you don't want to just focus on using a best practice for each consumer cohort we're talking about. It's so important to make sure that the brand is interested in investing beyond just Hispanic Heritage Month or a key event for Hispanics, because then it looks like you're pandering, and that's a different strategy altogether.
Agreed. Yeah, we have a question here from Sadira. Many clients say Hispanics go to English first pages, so they are capturing them with their general market efforts. So how do we make a case that it's still important to have a bilingual or Spanish dominant pages, which I think this really points to the research, right?
Yeah, this is the proof point right here, the research. It's very important that they have that experience in the Spanish page, because what happens, so they're going to English pages, but again, remember this bi-directional toggle. Is it them or they're having someone else go to the English page? So you're already one consumer removed from the actual engagement with your brand and your website. So it's important that you have Spanish pages for those consumers who require Spanish, or a very easy way to translate that is informed by the brand, so it's not just a cold translation. Even if it's just key areas of the site that you can one click have the Spanish there, I think that would serve you well.
Great. I think that was the last question. We're running up here on our time. Thank you everyone for joining. We recorded this webinar, so it's going to be available. I believe we're going to make it available there on website, one of the landing pages. Thank you, everyone. Really great questions. Yeah, any parting words, Maria?
No, just thank you so much for listening and taking the time. And we hope that this research moves our whole consumer cohort forward, and that we will continue to do some more research to drive greater awareness and engagement across the board for all brands.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Bye.